In 1946, Harlem, the KKK lynched Bumpy Johnson's nephew in broad daylight, then left the body hanging as a warning. 7 days later, 12 men were destroyed and the police closed every file without making a single arrest. When terror acts openly and the law looks away, who really controls justice? At 6:23 a.m., Marcus Garvey Park was already awake, but not alive. A rope creaked lightly from an oak tree near the north entrance, drawing the attention of an elderly woman walking her dog before church. From a distance, the shape looked like debris caught overnight. Up close, it became unmistakable, and her scream cut through Harlem's morning calm. Police units arrived at 6:47 a.m., lights on sirens deliberately off. The park felt unusually empty, as if the city had stepped back to watch. No bystanders crowded the scene. A young black man hung 3 feet above the ground, his body tilted forward, his neck twisted just enough to tell experienced eyes that this death had not been quick or voluntary. Detective Robert Walsh stopped several feet short of the tree. Officers later said he didn't move because he didn't need to. The evidence announced itself. The victim's hands bore deep rope burns, raw and uneven, the kind left by desperate attempts to pry a tightening noose away from the throat. One shoe was missing. The grass beneath the body was crushed flat, scuffed by heels digging for leverage. This was not a quiet death. It had taken time, pressure, and more than one set of hands. Walsh examined the rope. It was thick industrial grade, the kind commonly found in garages and warehouses. The knot was tight and clean, tied by someone who knew exactly how much force it would take and how long to apply it. Pinned to the victim's chest was a folded sheet of paper, fixed carefully with a straight pin. The handwriting was crude, but steady block letters pressed firmly into the page. There was no sign of panic or haste. Colors know your place. The note was not written for the victim. It wasn't written for the police. It was written for Harlem. The oak tree stood in clear view of 3 streets. Anyone leaving for work, heading to church, or opening a storefront that morning would see it. This location was not accidental. It was chosen for exposure. This was not a killing meant to disappear. It was meant to be witnessed. Walsh surveyed the area again. No weapon lay nearby. No pockets had been turned out. The victim's wallet was still inside his jacket. Robbery was never part of the plan. The message was the point. When Walsh finally opened the wallet, his hands betrayed years of discipline. Inside was a Columbia University student ID, first-year pre-law. The photograph showed a young man with thick glasses and a cautious smile. Thomas Johnson. Walsh exhaled slowly. Not that Johnson. His partner, Detective Sullivan, stepped closer. Who is he? Walsh held the card a moment longer than necessary. Thomas Johnson, he said. We need to notify his uncle. Sullivan didn't ask which uncle. In Harlem, the name carried weight. Both men understood what that connection meant and what it could bring. The coroner's van arrived without spectacle. No reporters followed, no cameras appeared. Just uniforms, notebooks, and the quiet recognition that this case would not follow an ordinary path. Walsh crouched near the base of the tree. 5 cigarette butts lay pressed together in the dirt, all different brands smoked down to the filter. Men waiting. Nearby, overlapping boot prints cut into the soil, heavy work boots factory issued practical. This had not been rushed. It had been planned. Sullivan finally spoke. What do we write? The question wasn't procedural, it was strategic. Walsh didn't answer right away. He looked at the rope burns again, then at the note. He thought about 1946, about jury boxes, about verdicts that never came. He thought about what would actually happen if 5 white men were accused of lynching a black college student in New York City. After a long pause, Walsh stood. Suicide, he said. Sullivan turned sharply. You're sure? Walsh's jaw tightened. Write suicide. File it. Notify the family, he replied. Then quieter. And stay out of whatever happens next. The body was cut down and placed in the van. The rope was removed, but the tree was left standing. By the time the doors closed, the message had already spread beyond the park. Harlem would see it. Harlem would understand it. And one man whose name the police had not yet spoken aloud would read it as something else entirely. Because this was not just a killing, it was a warning. What entered the official record reflected only what the system permitted itself to acknowledge. Everything else remained at the scene. By 8:15 a.m., the body had been removed from Marcus Garvey Park, but the decision that mattered most had already been made. It wasn't made at headquarters, and it wasn't written down at first. It happened quietly between two detectives standing under an oak tree weighing facts against consequences. Detective Robert Walsh and Detective Sullivan had both seen enough crime scenes to recognize a staged death. The rope burns the struggle marks the note pinned to the chest, none of it fits suicide. And yet neither man reached for handcuffs or a radio call for homicide backup. Instead, they reached for something else restrained. Back at the precinct, the air felt heavier than usual. Typewriters clacked, phones rang, but the room seemed to avoid one desk in particular. Walsh sat with the preliminary report in front of him, pen hovering above the paper, delaying the inevitable. Sullivan stood nearby, arms crossed, watching the clock. Once we write it, he said, there's no walking it back. Walsh didn't argue. They both understood that reports didn't just record events, they decided what was allowed to exist. The question wasn't whether Thomas Johnson had been murdered. The question was what would happen if they said so. Walsh thought about the year 1946, about juries drawn from neighborhoods that didn't look like Harlem, about cases that collapsed before they ever reached trial, about what happened to cops who pushed too hard against lines everyone pretended weren't there. He had spent 20 years on the force. He knew which fights ended careers and which ones ended lives. Sullivan lowered his voice. 5 white men lynch a black college kid in New York City, he said. You think anyone's convicting them? Walsh didn't respond. The answer was already in the silence. The system didn't need protecting from criminals that morning. It needed protecting from itself. When Walsh finally began to write, the language shifted immediately. No signs of forced entry. No eyewitnesses. Victim found deceased, cause undetermined. Each phrase shaved away something real, something visible, something undeniable. By the time he reached the conclusion, the truth had been reduced to a technicality. One word completed the transformation: suicide. Sullivan read it over Walsh's shoulder. He didn't correct anything. He didn't add anything. He nodded once, a gesture that carried resignation more than agreement. They both knew the report wouldn't raise questions. It would close them. The coroner's findings followed the same path. No extended analysis. No challenge to the narrative. In the official file, Thomas Johnson stopped being a victim of violence and became a tragic statistic. A young man who, according to paper, had chosen a tree over a future. Walsh signed his name at the bottom of the page. The ink dried quickly. The moment it did, the case changed status, not solved, but sealed. From that point on, any attempt to reopen it would require more than evidence. It would require permission. And permission wasn't coming. Sullivan broke the quiet again. What about the note Walsh didn't look up? Unverified, could have been planted after death. The rope burns, consistent with hanging. Each answer followed procedure, not truth. The report didn't deny the facts. It buried them under language. By noon, the file had been logged. By evening, it had been archived. No alerts were sent to organized crime units. No inquiries were made into extremist groups operating in the city. The system had done what it did best when confronted with something it couldn't fix. It minimized it. Walsh went home that night without telling his wife what he'd seen. Sullivan stopped for a drink and left it untouched. Both men understood that by calling the death a suicide, they hadn't prevented violence. They had redirected it. Because someone else would read that report too. Someone who knew the victim. Someone who understood exactly what the police had chosen not to do. And when the law steps aside, it doesn't create peace. It creates a vacuum. In many periods of history, official reports marked the furthest point the truth was allowed to reach. Everything beyond that line existed without protection. Thomas Johnson believed in the law long before the law ever noticed him. He carried that belief quietly, the way some people carry faith without needing to announce it. At 19, he was already planning a life built around courtroom statutes and arguments made on paper instead of fists. He was a first-year student at Columbia University pre-law, commuting from Harlem each morning. Thick-rimmed glasses, pressed shirts, books, always under one arm. Professors described him as disciplined, methodical, the kind of student who listened more than he spoke and remembered everything he heard. Thomas wanted to be a civil rights attorney, not because it sounded noble, but because he believed the system could be corrected from the inside. He believed that if the rules were applied properly, if the law was followed as written, injustice would eventually lose. That belief had been shaped at home. He lived with his mother, Ruth Johnson, in a modest apartment on 135th Street. Ruth worked long hours and spoke rarely about hardship, but neighbors said she never missed one of her son's milestones. Thomas was her only child, and in many ways her proof that the world could still move forward. On Sundays, Thomas walked through Marcus Garvey Park just after dawn to attend church. Same route, same time, same Bible tucked under his arm. He believed in routine because routine meant safety. Someone had been watching. Friends from the neighborhood remembered Thomas as quiet but deliberate. He didn't run numbers. He didn't linger on corners. He kept his distance from the street life that surrounded him not out of fear, but out of focus. He believed the law would be there when he needed it. That belief made him visible. In 1946, Harlem visibility carried risk. Education marked progress, but it also marked defiance. To some, Thomas represented a future they didn't want arriving. The police report would later describe him as emotionally troubled. The word appeared without explanation, unsupported by history or testimony. No one from Columbia was interviewed. No professor was contacted. No friend was asked to speak. On paper, Thomas became an abstraction. In the neighborhood, he remained a person. Church members remembered his questions after services. Neighbors remembered him helping elderly tenants carry groceries upstairs. Ruth remembered the night he told her he wanted to argue cases in front of judges who looked like they'd never known Harlem. He said the law had to hear us, she told one neighbor later. Not fear us, hear us. That belief did not survive the oak tree. The system Thomas trusted did not investigate his death. It labeled it and moved on. The same rules he studied were applied selectively carefully in a way that protected procedure but abandoned purpose. Thomas never imagined the law could fail so quietly. He had believed that evidence mattered, that facts carried weight, that a note pinned to a body would demand answers instead of silence. What he didn't understand yet was that the law did not break when it failed him. It simply chose not to engage. In the days after his death, Ruth received no detailed explanation. No investigator sat with her to discuss findings. No official walked her through timelines or suspects. She was handed paperwork and condolences, neither of which explained how her son had ended up in a tree. Neighbors filled the gap instead. Stories circulated quietly past between doorways and church pews. People spoke in lowered voices about the note about men seen in the park before sunrise, about how quickly the police had closed the case. These accounts never reached a courtroom, but they did not disappear. They stayed where official records could not reach them. Thomas Johnson wanted to be a lawyer because he believed the law could protect people like his mother. Instead, his death exposed the limits of that protection. It revealed how easily the system could close ranks, rewrite language, and call it resolution. In the end, Thomas didn't lose the faith because he doubted justice. He lost it because justice never showed up. And when the file went silent, Harlem did what it had always done when institutions failed to listen. It remembered. When official records fall quiet, community memory becomes the only archive left standing. The call reached Bumpy Johnson shortly after 7:12 a.m. It did not come from police, and it did not come with details. The voice on the other end hesitated before speaking, as if choosing words carefully might soften what could not be softened. Boss, the man said, it's Thomas, Ruth's boy. They found him in the park. Bumpy did not respond right away. Those close to him would later say he held the receiver without speaking long enough for the silence to become uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, stripped of emotion. How he asked. They're calling it suicide. The line went dead. Bumpy sat in his office for several minutes after the call ended. No movement, no orders given. He had survived prison gang wars, betrayals, and years of calculated violence. None of it prepared him for the stillness that followed those words. He did not call the police. He did not call his men. Instead, he stood, put on his coat, and walked 4 blocks to his sister's apartment. Ruth Johnson was seated on her couch when Bumpy arrived, surrounded by neighbors who had come without being asked. The room smelled of coffee that no one had touched. When she saw her brother, she looked up as if she already knew what he would say. "They took my baby," she said. Bumpy sat beside her and took her hand. He did not deny the police version. He did not correct it either. He listened as Ruth spoke in short, broken sentences about Thomas's routine, his Bible, the route he took every Sunday morning. "They said he did it to himself," she said. "My son would never." Bumpy nodded once. "I know." Ruth turned toward him. "Then what was it?" "It was murder," he said. "And they wanted us to see it." The word they did not need explanation. Ruth's body shook as she cried, grief giving way to something sharper. "Will the police do anything?" she asked. Bumpy did not answer immediately. When he did, his response was honest, not comforting. "No." The silence that followed was heavier than the words. Ruth understood what that meant. In Harlem, the absence of action had always spoken louder than promises. After a long moment, Ruth wiped her eyes. "Then what happens now?" Bumpy leaned closer and lowered his voice. "Nothing public," he said. "No speeches. No calls. No noise." He paused. "If this becomes public, the city will circle itself and close ranks." Ruth looked at him. "And Thomas?" "He doesn't need headlines," Bumpy replied. "He needs this to stop." That was the moment the decision was made. Not in a meeting, not with witnesses. In a living room where grief and clarity arrived at the same time. Bumpy would not challenge the report. He would not demand a hearing. He would not ask the courts to correct themselves. He had seen too many cases where the law responded only after damage was done. This one was already buried. By midday, Harlem knew. Word traveled the way it always had through Stoops barbershops, church basements. People spoke quietly, not because they were afraid, but because they were watching. They noticed what the papers did not say. They noticed how quickly the case was closed. They noticed who did not show up to ask questions. Bumpy noticed too. He returned to Marcus Garvey Park alone that afternoon. The rope was gone, but the ground told the rest of the story. Cigarette butts still pressed into the dirt. Boot prints still visible where the morning dew had not settled. He did not take photographs. He did not speak to anyone in uniform. He memorized what he saw. This was not evidence for a courtroom. It was information for something else. When Bumpy left the park, he did not issue instructions. He made no threats. He simply understood that the law had chosen not to act and that choice carried consequences. Harlem did not erupt that day. There were no riots, no marches, no statements released. The neighborhood absorbed the news and waited. So did Bumpy. Because when justice does not arrive through courts, it does not disappear. It changes form. It moves quietly, gathering detail, measuring response, deciding when silence has lasted long enough. The reactions that followed were rarely captured in headlines. What Harlem felt in those hours existed mostly outside the record where official attention did not reach. The men who killed Thomas Johnson did not come from the shadows people expected. They were not drifters from the South or outsiders passing through Harlem. They lived nearby, worked regular jobs, and returned home each night to families who believed they were ordinary men. In 1946, the Ku Klux Klan was not confined to rural backroads. Northern cells operated quietly in cities like New York, Chicago, and Boston, blending into industrial neighborhoods where anonymity came easily. Their power came not from numbers, but from confidence that no one would confront them. In Harlem, a 15-man cell met twice a month in a warehouse on East 98th Street, just beyond the neighborhood's borders. They chose that location carefully, close enough to observe, far enough to retreat. To the city, it was just another unused building. The 5 men who carried out the lynching were selected internally. There was no ceremony, no robes that morning, no speeches. This was not a ritual. It was an assignment. Danny Morrison worked at an auto repair shop in the Bronx. Rick Sullivan clocked in at a factory off the Hudson Line. Lou Bennett hunted on weekends and talked about nature like it owed him something. Frank Dorsey stocked shelves at a wholesale distributor. Charlie Ross fixed elevators and drank too much when he thought no one was watching. None of them looked dangerous. They met most Friday nights at Ali's Tavern on East 96th Street, a bar where no one asked questions as long as tabs were paid and voices stayed low. They drank cheap whiskey, laughed loudly, and spoke in half sentences meant to sound like jokes. The bartender learned early not to interrupt. Their habits were consistent. Same stools, same exit door, same time they paid and left together. They believed repetition was safety. They chose Thomas Johnson because he represented everything they resented: educated, visible, unafraid to walk Harlem in daylight carrying a Bible and a future. To them, he wasn't just a target. He was a statement waiting to be corrected. They had watched him for weeks. On the morning of the lynching, they arrived at Marcus Garvey Park before sunrise. They smoked while they waited, joking quietly, confident that the city would not interfere. 5 men against 1 teenager was not in their minds a risk. It was certainty. Afterward, they returned to their routines without adjusting anything. They went to work. They went home. They met again at Ali's Tavern and drank to what they called a job done right. They spoke openly, assuming the walls would protect them. The police report confirmed their confidence. Suicide. Case closed. No investigation. They mistook silence for immunity. What they did not understand was that the report was not the only document being read that week. Names were being remembered, patterns noticed, movements logged. Their greatest mistake was believing fear only traveled one direction. By the second day, the 5 men noticed nothing unusual. By the third, they dismissed rumors as paranoia. By the fourth, they told themselves Harlem had already forgotten. They had confused patience with weakness. They believed no one would respond because no one ever had. They believed the law's refusal to act was proof of permanent protection. They believed the city's silence meant permission. What they did not consider was that some silences are deliberate, that some responses do not announce themselves, that some consequences arrive only after being measured. They lived as if nothing could reach them. That belief did not survive the week. Organizations that operate in darkness often assume the law will always look the other way. What they rarely consider is who watches when the law does. Day 1-2, the first answer. The first response did not arrive with sirens or warrants. It arrived quietly within 48 hours in a form that mirrored what had already been done. The method was familiar enough to be understood without explanation. Those who heard about it did not hear details. They heard placement, timing, and restraint. The message was precise, and it carried the same clarity as the one left in Marcus Garvey Park. No public statement followed. No claim of responsibility surfaced. But Harlem noticed the symmetry, and the neighborhood understood that something had begun moving. By the end of the second day, people stopped asking whether Thomas Johnson's death would be addressed. The question changed to how far the response would travel. Day 3-4. The spread. On the third day, the response widened. It did not escalate in volume, but in reach. What had started as a reflection became a pattern. Fire replaced rope, not as spectacle, but as consequence. Buildings that had always stood untouched were suddenly gone, their absence louder than any explosion. One man lost his home overnight. Another lost his mind over several hours. No gunshots were reported. No war was declared. The violence moved without uniforms, without banners, and without witnesses willing to speak. Hospitals treated injuries without asking questions. Fire departments wrote reports that explained damage but not cause. The city recorded incidents without connecting them. Harlem did the opposite. By the fourth day, the pattern was impossible to miss. The events were not random, and they were not impulsive. Each outcome carried a relationship to what had happened under the oak tree. The message was expanding, and it was deliberate. Day 5-6. The collapse. By the 5th day, those still untouched began to understand that survival was no longer about distance. Changing routines did not help. Leaving town did not guarantee safety. The response was not chasing them. It was waiting. Men who had once moved with confidence began looking over their shoulders. They stopped meeting in familiar places. They slept lightly. Some stopped sleeping altogether. What they did not understand was that panic had arrived too late. The consequences no longer needed to announce themselves. By the 6th day, outcomes were irreversible. Lives were altered beyond repair, not through a single act, but through accumulation. Homes could not be rebuilt quickly. Minds did not return to baseline. The damage did not ask permission to linger. Those who remained alive understood something crucial by then. Running was no longer an option because the response was not pursuing escape routes. It was closing accounts. This was not retaliation driven by rage. It was execution driven by calculation. Throughout the 6 days, the police remained officially unaware. No task force was assembled. No emergency meeting was called. Each incident was logged independently, stripped of context. The system recorded damage, not design. The absence of gunfire mattered. So did the absence of claims. Without a declared enemy, there was nothing for the city to confront. Without a visible organization, there was nothing to dismantle. The response stayed ahead of reaction. By the end of the 6th day, Harlem no longer whispered. It watched. The neighborhood understood that something had reached its final phase. The message had traveled far enough. What remained was resolution. No official document would ever connect these days. No memo would trace the line from rope to fire to collapse. The record would remain fragmented by design, but the consequences were unified. People adjusted their behavior without being told to. Doors stayed closed. Meetings dissolved. Associations broke quietly without explanation. The response did not seek acknowledgement. It sought permanence. Those who survived the 6 days carried something worse than injury. They carried certainty. They knew the response had not been exhausted, only completed. And they knew the city would not intervene, because nothing about those 7 days required the system's permission. The law had already stepped aside. What followed filled the space that decision created. No official ledger ever recorded the sequence of those days. What endured were the outcomes measured not in charges or convictions, but in absences that lasted for years. By the morning of the 7th day, Charlie Ross understood he had run out of time. 4 men he had once trusted were gone in different ways, each disappearance more precise than the last. The pattern no longer needed interpretation. It was speaking directly to him. Charlie was not the boldest among them. He had hesitated the morning Thomas Johnson died, a pause that lasted only seconds but never left him. In the days that followed, that hesitation became his sentence. He stopped sleeping at home. He changed routes. He counted footsteps behind him that never materialized. Fear did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated detail by detail until the city itself felt hostile. At 5:30 a.m., Charlie made a decision that felt logical and desperate at the same time. He would go to the police, confess everything. Names, locations, the warehouse, the meetings. Prison felt safer than the streets. He never made it to the precinct. 3 blocks from the station, his car was boxed in on a narrow side street. The move was clean, practiced, and fast enough to remove doubt. A man stepped into view and knocked calmly on Charlie's window. "Get out," he said. Charlie recognized him immediately. The face had been seen before, always at a distance, always observing. He stepped out of the car, shaking hands, visible voice already breaking. "I'm going to confess," Charlie said. "I'll tell them everything." The man didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He reached into his coat and removed a photograph, holding it steady between them. Thomas Johnson, smiling, wearing his Columbia sweatshirt. His name was Thomas, the man said. He was 19. He wanted to be a lawyer. Charlie collapsed onto the pavement, the image cutting through every excuse he had rehearsed. "I didn't want to do it," Charlie said. "Danny made us." The response came without emotion. "Danny's gone." Charlie looked up, searching for mercy he no longer expected. "I'll leave," he said. "California. You'll never see me again." The man shook his head. "You're going to deliver a message." That message was simple. At 9:00 p.m., the full cell would meet at the warehouse on East 98th Street. They would vote. Disband and leave New York, or stay and accept what had already been demonstrated. If they stayed, there would be no more warnings. Charlie was released with no escort, no threat repeated. He drove directly to the warehouse, hands trembling on the steering wheel. By the time he arrived, others were already there, drawn by fear and curiosity in equal measure. 15 men gathered under flickering lights. Charlie spoke first because silence was no longer an option. He told them about Danny, about fire, about collapse, about how close the response had come each time and how deliberate it had been. Some laughed. Others went quiet. "He's bluffing," one man said. "One gangster doesn't scare 15. Charlie didn't argue. He didn't need to. The evidence had already spoken. The vote was taken without ceremony, no names recorded, no minutes kept. 10 voted to stay. 5 voted to leave. The 5 who chose to leave walked out immediately. Charlie was among them. He did not look back." Across the street, unseen figures counted. The decision had been made. No official record would ever show what happened in that warehouse. No meeting minutes survived. No testimony followed. The outcome arrived without explanation and left without commentary. Those who voted believed they were choosing strength. They were choosing permanence, because some decisions do not need witnesses to carry consequences. They only need agreement. And once that agreement is reached, there is no appeal. There is no transcript of that meeting, only the effects that followed. History preserved the result, not the vote. The fire began at 11:47 p.m., when most of the city had already turned away from the day. Neighbors on East 98th Street would later say they smelled gasoline seconds before they heard glass break. By the time flames became visible through the warehouse windows, the outcome was already decided. The building ignited fast. 6 separate points of fire appeared almost at once, feeding on stored materials and trapped air. Inside, men shouted and ran, discovering too late that the exits they expected to use no longer opened. The front door had been chained from the outside. The back exit opened briefly, just long enough for a few to escape before smoke filled the corridor. Firefighters arrived within minutes, but the structure was already compromised. The heat forced them back, repeatedly delaying entry while the roof weakened. From the street, the warehouse looked like a single contained incident, another industrial fire in a city that saw dozens every year. Inside, it was anything but ordinary. 7 men died in that building. 3 others escaped with severe burns and injuries that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Those who survived did not speak publicly afterward. The fire department's preliminary report listed improper storage of flammable materials as the likely cause. No accelerants were officially confirmed. No external tampering was documented. The door chains were noted and dismissed. Within 48 hours, the investigation was closed. The final report labeled the incident an accident, citing the age of the building and lack of eyewitness testimony. No suspects were named. No follow-up inquiries were scheduled. The file moved quickly from active to archived. Detective Walsh read the report the same way he had read the earlier one, carefully, quietly, without annotation. He understood the pattern now, even if the paperwork refused to acknowledge it. There was no press conference, no appeal for information. The warehouse was cordoned off, then forgotten. By the end of the week, city crews cleared the debris. What remained was absence. Neighbors noticed the silence first. The men who had once gathered near that building no longer appeared. The bar across the street lost its loudest customers overnight. Conversation stopped mid-sentence when the fire was mentioned. The city adjusted without being told to. No charges were filed because there was no official crime to prosecute. The case did not fail, it ended exactly as it was written to. The system closed the door on itself just as it had before. The lack of questions was not oversight. It was consistency. Fire inspectors, police, and city officials all followed protocol. Each step adhered to procedure. Each decision removed responsibility without violating policy. In that way, the fire was resolved before anyone had time to wonder what resolution meant. For Harlem, the conclusion required no explanation. The sequence had been visible for days. What happened in the warehouse did not feel sudden. It felt final. The message had reached its endpoint. No memorial marked the site. No plaque explained what had been lost there. The building's address returned to the city's inventory stripped of context. What endured was the understanding that some fires are never meant to be investigated. They are meant to conclude. By the time the last report was filed, the response that began under an oak tree had completed its arc. Nothing remained to escalate. Nothing remained to prove. The system recorded an accident. Harlem recorded a decision. Some incidents close so quickly that no official question has time to form. What remains is not uncertainty, but a silence shaped by choice. Thomas Johnson's funeral was held 3 days after the fire. More than 3,000 people filled Abyssinian Baptist Church, spilling onto the sidewalk in quiet rows. The casket remained closed at his mother's request. She wanted Harlem to remember her son alive, not as an image borrowed from terror. No speeches mentioned the warehouse. No pastor referenced the fire directly. The service stayed focused on Thomas the student, the son, the boy who believed the law would one day speak back to him. Bumpy Johnson stood beside his sister throughout the service. He did not address the crowd. He did not acknowledge the attention. Those who knew him understood that silence in that moment was not absence. After the burial, something in Harlem shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. The Ku Klux Klan did not announce its retreat. There were no statements, no arrests, no public unraveling. The cell that had operated near East 98th Street simply stopped meeting. Men who had once moved confidently through certain bars never returned. Warehouse lights stayed dark. Conversations that once took place in half-whispers ended entirely. No court ever reviewed the case. No grand jury was convened. No indictment was written. The official record contained a suicide, a series of unrelated incidents, and an accidental fire. On paper, nothing connected. In practice, everything did. Harlem absorbed the outcome without celebration. There were no marches, no declarations of victory. The neighborhood adjusted its expectations quietly as it always had. Parents changed the routes their children walked. Business owners locked doors earlier. Men who trafficked in fear chose different neighborhoods. An unwritten rule settled into place. It did not come from legislation. It was not enforced by patrol cars or judges. It existed because it had proven itself. After September 1946, no KKK activity was reported in Harlem for years. Not because hatred disappeared, but because presence did. The cost of bringing terror north had become too high. Police noticed the absence, though it was never discussed in reports. Extremist investigations shifted elsewhere. Files remained thin. Silence became the most reliable indicator. For Ruth Johnson, the absence meant something else. It meant her son's name was no longer spoken in official settings, but it remained alive in kitchens, classrooms, and church halls. Thomas Johnson did not become a case study. He became a reference point. In later years, when reporters asked Bumpy Johnson about that September, he declined to elaborate. He did not deny responsibility. He did not confirm it either. He said only that some systems fail quietly, and when they do, communities find ways to protect themselves. History recorded no verdict, no balance sheet of guilt or innocence. It recorded a change in behavior. That change endured longer than any headline. When terror stopped returning, people stopped asking why. They understood the answer was not written anywhere official. It was written into conduct. When no one dares repeat an act, it is the clearest evidence that power has changed hands. No trial followed September 1946. No criminal charges were filed. No official apology was ever written into the record. The file closed quietly. But Harlem changed. Not through new laws or public statements, but through memory, through a shared understanding of what happens when terror is ignored. People didn't debate it. They adjusted to it. Thomas Johnson wanted to be a lawyer. He believed the law would listen, that truth would matter if it was presented clearly. Instead, the system he trusted labeled his death a suicide and moved on. When the courts chose silence, the community chose awareness. After that year, the KKK did not return to Harlem. Not because justice arrived in a courtroom, but because consequences arrived without one. No announcements followed, behavior changed, and the noise stopped. This file was never reopened, not because it lacked meaning, but because its outcome was already understood. If stories like this matter to you, like this video, share it and subscribe. We document the cases history left unfinished, the ones that never reached court but still decided who held power. When the law stopped speaking, who should keep the record?